Welcome to Voluble Minds, reflections on and abbreviated readings of famous philosophical dialogues. I'm Colin Wulff, Assistant Director of Religious Education at the Fourth Universalist Society in New York City. If you would like to skip the introductory segment on today's philosopher and dialogue and go straight to the reading, the timestamp posted in the video description will help you to do that. Thank you for joining us. Our second and final George Berkeley dialogue, Alciphron, the minute philosopher, a defense of the Christian religion against the so-called free thinkers, was written 19 years later than Hylas and Philinus, and thus it assumes or extends many of the same ideas, so to speak. According to Berkeley, we can't conceive of properties not perceptible to us, and therefore there must be no underlying existence besides those properties, which he calls ideas, and which are made clear to us by way of God's continuous involvement. You might hear echoes of Malebranche's occasionalism or the Cartesian continuous creation. These related theories would not stand up well to the, in Berkeley's time, 4-century-old principle of Occam's razor, if God wasn't considered an incontrovertible starting assumption. William of Occam was a Franciscan friar best remembered for his recommendation that we trust in the simplest explanations. If subtracting intervening steps is simplicity, in one respect Berkeley does simplify the view of his predecessors. He takes a harder line than Malebranche on matter, declaring it not merely to be superfluous, but to not exist at all. This removes a key difficulty for Malebranche, but invites other problems, not least because material extensibility was one feature of nature on which the other empiricists broadly agreed. This dialogue also tackles the role of language and its representative function. Berkeley says names can provisionally stand in for general ideas because they don't necessarily require that we envision their given object. Remember, he didn't think general ideas could be separated from their particulars. But he says the moment that we do envision whatever a word prompts, we are back to the old problem of not being able to do so in general terms at all. Words, then, are not in themselves pure expressions of general ideas. A major example in the coming dialogue is that of the word number. Is Berkeley right that we can't have a qualitative relationship to a specific numerical concept like 2, given a verbalized digit? What of really large numbers none of us can visualize with precision? Berkeley's ideas are suspended between Platonic ideals, actual perfected manifestations of what we recognize as abstract ideas, which Berkeley thought nonsensical, and Aristotle's answer to that concept, universals, which are qualities inhered in particulars. Aristotle thought objects were a combination of material substrate and form, and this is where he loses Berkeley, who denies matter's role in existence. The uses of language in signifying general concepts were helpful, according to Berkeley, but not proof of universals. Rather, words, for him, are merely intuitive tools for grouping sufficiently similar particulars at the level of concepts like numbers. He didn't want anyone to be confused about the actual existence of general concepts. Alciphron, the character, tries to stick up for math as an instinctive, immutable endowment, indirectly recalling Plato's theory of knowledge as recollection. Alciphron suggests that some geometry is innate, because it is true in itself, regardless of our perception. Euphrynor, speaking for Berkeley, argues back that geometrical concepts are, like words, just a mediate way to describe perceptive instincts in which the representations do not inhere necessarily. Distance can be described by acute and obtuse angles, but that's not how we process depth and dimension naturally, he says. In the post-dialogue section, we'll explore this idea as it pertains to a more contemporary understanding of optics and neural adaptability. In an uncharacteristically soft turn, we do get a bit of an ecological bent towards the end of this dialogue. Berkeley suggests that community and interdependence are actually values very much in keeping with nature's pattern, if nature's pattern is to be valued, which of course it is, being no more than a series of impressions generated and sustained by God. This might remind you of Leibniz's idea that to worship the creation is to worship the creator. Unlike other logical theologians, we'll call them theologians, like Thomas Aquinas and Anselm of Canterbury, whom we mentioned in our Malebranche unit, Berkeley is less known for proofs for God than he is for his startling explanation of a system that takes God for granted at the outset. In retrospect, it is also easy to see this as a rather desperate plug for a system that had the virtue of needing a God. It's as though Berkeley was anticipating Laplace, the polymathic scholar born just 4 years prior to Berkeley's death. Laplace's contributions to thought are many, including an early articulation of scientific determinism. A legend has it that he responded to Napoleon's wonder at the absence of a creator in his appraisal of the universe's motions by saying, "I have no need of that hypothesis." Well, the reality that Berkeley propounds is entirely dependent on it. Berkeley's assumption of perceptible nature as a necessary and clear sign of the creator is a presage of the debate we will experience via David Hume in our next unit. Hume challenges the notion that the human mind is even capable of gauging a deity's qualities by what we see in the world around us. Let's look at where the God assumption rests in variations on this theme. In Hume's Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, his character Philo will confront some of the proofs for God popularized by the Aristotelian Catholic theologian Thomas Aquinas. One of Hume's oppositional characters will be more focused on arguments from contingency and cause, the idea that everything relies on or is caused by a prior thing. And eventually, we must find our way back to an uncreated, uncaused God, lest we infinitely regress. Even if we are right about the need for a first cause, an unmoved mover, to use the concept Aquinas would borrow from Aristotle, this of course offers us no grounds for projecting a divine status or even consciousness onto it, unless you finesse it and just define divinity as a first cause, whatever its other attributes, and some theologians aren't above that. Regardless, this proof is still not free from assuming the end it claims to demonstrate. Another Hume character will take the approach that God is evident in God's works in the natural world, and that the orderly design and glimpses of perfection and purpose we observe in our lives must indicate a pure perfection behind it. This invokes a decidedly impeachable standard of perfection and conflates it uncritically with a self confirming definition of God, again, turning the object of the proof into an assumption on which it relies. Between these two Hume characters, we see a summary of the Thomist commitment to reconciling faith and reason, which Berkeley, in his own distinct way, seems to be claiming is possible here. Hume will drive a convincing wedge between any attempts to marry the two, and he will do so with the audacious promise of safeguarding faith as a truer expression of belief. So this raises the question, was the kind of faith and assumption implicit in Berkeley's idealism a better way to sustain his system than the so-called proofs of Anselm and Aquinas? Berkeley manages more than either of those theologians to escape Spinoza's criticism in his theological political treatise of clerical scholars as not teaching anything but speculations of Platonists and Aristotelians, to which, in order to save their credit for Christianity, they have made Holy Writ conform. Was Berkeley the wiser for not focusing his argument on grammatical thimble rigs of this kind, and rather investing in a worldview that didn't merely point symptomatically to a conscious creator, but could not, in contrast to what Laplace purportedly said, in any way do without that hypothesis? Our second to last Berkeley dialogue will give him one more chance in this series to make that case to you. Berkeley's dialogues outdo possibly any of the others in our lineup, except maybe Hobbes, for caustic, passive aggression, or outright supercilious smackdowns of his antagonists, though for Hobbes the attitude was generally not directed at the other speaker, and Berkeley has no such compunction. The original dialogue features 5 speakers, a narrator, then the 2 freethinkers, Alciphron, for whom the dialogue is named, and Lysicles, who speak against Berkeley's 2 mouthpieces, Euphranor and Crito. We will be taking Euphranor and Alciphron sections only for simplicity's sake. Alciphron, set up to lose the encounter or to benefit from it by reversing his position, nonetheless acquits himself pretty well for a dialectical quintin. Berkeley's relative fortifying of his opposites is perhaps what licenses his ruder treatment of the characters he consigns to the losing side. I'm joined in this dialogue by my old friend Anthony Leung, who will be reading Alciphron to my Euphranor. Anthony is an actor and musician. He was a double major in theater and jazz studies at Oberlin College, where we met, and where he also participated in the Asian American Alliance, which aimed to increase awareness of Asian American struggles and cultural identity. He returned to New York, where he studied acting at both Circle in the Square and the Stella Adler Studio. He has worked on multiple projects with the downtown theater company Mabu Mines as both a stagehand and performer. He's currently a member of the Stairwell Theater Company, where he has worked in productions as an actor, composer, and musician. There will be a post-dialogue reflection exploring some popular inquiries that have stemmed from Berkeley's idealism, and we'll also be looking at how some other philosophers have dealt with the problems of perception and existence. Alciphron is in the public domain. Please enjoy.
Tell me, Euphranor, isn't truth a single, uniform, invariable thing? And if it is, Isn't the existence of the many different and mutually inconsistent notions that men have of God and duty a plain proof that there is no truth in them?
I freely grant that truth is constant and uniform, so that two opinions that contradict one another can't both be true, but it doesn't follow that they are both false. When there are conflicting opinions about the same thing, the one, if there is one, that is grounded on clear and evident reasons should be regarded as true, and others accepted only to the extent that they are consistent with that privileged one. Reason is the same as 2,000 years ago, when Socrates seems to have reasoned himself into the same notion of a god that is entertained by the philosophers of our days, if you will allow someone who isn't a free thinker to be called a philosopher. And consider Confucius's remark that a man should be on guard in his youth against lust, in manhood against quarrelsomeness, and in old age against greed. This morality is as current in Europe as in China.
But when opinions differ, that shows that there is uncertainty. So, it would be good if all men thought the same way.
What do you think to be the cause of a lunar eclipse?
The Earth's coming between the sun and the moon, making the shadow on the moon.
Are you sure of this?
Certainly.
Are all mankind agreed in this truth?
By no means. Ignorant and barbarous people give different, ridiculous explanations for this phenomenon.
So it seems that there are different opinions about the nature of an eclipse.
There are.
Yet one of these opinions is true.
It is.
Thus, when there are conflicting opinions about something, it may still be the case that the thing exists, and one of the opinions about it is true.
I accept that.
Well, you argued from the variety of opinions about God's nature to the falsity of the opinion that he exists, and now it seems that this argument is not conclusive. And I don't see either how you can infer the falsity of any moral or religious tenet from men's conflicting opinions on the same subject. Isn't arguing like that on par with arguing that no historical account of a matter of fact can be true if reports of it conflict with one another? Or arguing that because the various schools of philosophy maintain different opinions, none of them can be in the right? Well, I don't doubt your ability to prove, Alciphron. But before I put you to the trouble of any more proofs, I'd like to know whether the notions of your minute philosophy are worth proving. I mean, whether they are useful and helpful to mankind.
As to that, let me tell you. A thing can be useful to one man's views and not to another's. But truth is truth. Whether or not it's useful, and it mustn't be evaluated by whether it's convenient for this or that man or sect.
But isn't the general good of mankind to be regarded as a rule or guide to evaluation of moral truths? Indeed, of all truths that direct or influence the moral actions of men.
It's not clear to me that that is right. I know, of course, that legislators, theologians, and politicians have always maintained that it is necessary for the well being of mankind that men should be kept in awe by the slavish notions of religion and morality. But even if you are right about what is convenient or helpful, how does that prove that these moral notions to be true? Convenience is one thing and truth is another. So a real philosopher will set aside all advantage and consider only truth itself.
As between someone who acts with design and someone who acts at random, which should we regard as the wiser?
The one who acts with design.
Well then, whoever acts with design acts for some end, and a wise man acts for a good end. The general happiness of mankind is the most excellent end, so those who pursue this end by the most appropriate methods should be regarded as the wisest men. A wise man is governed by wise notions rather than foolish ones. It seems to follow that someone who promotes the general well being of mankind by the proper necessary means is truly wise and acts on wise grounds.
The happiness of other men is not a part of my happiness. So, from my standpoint, it isn't a good. I mean, a true natural good. So, it can't be a reasonable end for me to aim at. because no wise man will pursue an end that doesn't concern him. I am talking about true natural ends, not the ends one might announce as political pretenses. This is the voice of nature, the fountain, source, and pattern of all that is good and wise.
So, would you like to follow nature and accept her as a guide and as a pattern for you to imitate?
I want that more than anything.
Where do you get this respect for nature from?
From the excellence of its productions.
For example, you say that there is usefulness and excellence in a plant because its many parts are connected and fitted to each other in such a way as to protect and nourish the whole plant, make the individual grow, and propagate the species, and also because we get pleasure and benefit from it. Grapes from a vine, shade or timber from an oak.
Just so.
Similarly, don't you infer the excellence of animal bodies from observing the structure and fitness of their many parts, which enables the parts to work together for the well being of each other as well as of the whole animal? Don't you also notice a natural union and cooperation between animals of the same species? And that even animals of different species have certain qualities and instincts through which they contribute to the exercise, nourishment, and delight of each other? Even inanimate, inorganic materials seem to have an excellence relative to each other throughout the whole system of the visible and natural world. Don't you see a mutual connection and correspondence of parts? And isn't that the basis for your idea of the perfection and order and beauty of nature?
I accept all this.
Now, didn't the Stoics, who were no more bigots than you are, say, and didn't you say a few minutes ago, that this pattern of natural order is one that rational agents ought to imitate?
I don't deny that this is true.
So oughtn't we infer the same union, order, and regularity in the moral world that we see in the natural world?
We ought.
Shouldn't it seem to follow from this that reasonable creatures were made for one another, and consequently that a man who wants to live according to nature ought to consider himself not as an independent individual whose happiness is unconnected with the happiness of others, but rather as the part of a whole for whose common good he ought to work together with the other parts, i.e., other men?
Wait a bit, Euphranor. I've just remembered that writers in optics tell us of an angle that the two optic axes make where they meet at the object being looked at. The more obtuse this angle is, the nearer it shows the object to be, and the more acute the angle, the further away the object is. And this holds not as something arbitrary that we learn by experience, but as a necessary connection that can be demonstrated.
So the mind discovers how far away things are by geometry.
It does.
Wouldn't it follow then that the only people who could see are those who have learned geometry and know something of lines and angles?
There's a sort of natural geometry that is acquired without learning.
But Alciphron, in order to construct a proof of any kind or deduce a conclusion from premises, don't I have to perceive how the terms are connected with one another in the premises and how the premises are connected with the conclusion? More generally, if I'm to know one thing X by means of another thing Y, don't I first have to know Y? When I perceive your meaning by your words, don't I have first to perceive the words themselves? And in any inference, don't I have to know the premises before I infer the conclusion?
All this is true.
Thus, whoever infers a nearer distance from a wider angle or a further distance from an acuter angle must first perceive the angles themselves. Someone who doesn't perceive those angles can't infer anything from them, can he?
It is as you say.
Now, ask the first man you meet whether he perceives or knows anything of those optic angles, or whether he ever thinks about them, or infers anything from them, whether by natural or by artificial geometry. How would you expect him to answer?
Candidly, I think he would answer that he knew nothing of those matters.
So it can't be true that men judge distance by angles, and that removes all the force from your argument to prove that distance is perceived by means of something that has a necessary connection with it.
I agree with you.
It seems to me that a man can know whether or not he perceives a thing, and if he does perceive it, he can know whether he does this immediately or mediately. And if he perceives it mediately, he can know whether he is doing this by means of something like or unlike the thing, necessarily or arbitrarily connected with it.
It seems so.
And isn't it certain that if distance is not perceived immediately, just by itself, or by means of any image that resembles it, or by means of any lines and angles that have a necessary connection with it, it is perceived only by means of experience?
It is?
Then doesn't it follow that a man who was born blind and was then enabled to see would, when he first gained his sight, take the things he saw to be not at any distance from him, but rather in his eye or in his mind?
I have to admit that this seems right.
It seems to follow from this that words can be significant even if they don't, every time they are used, arouse in our minds the ideas that they signify. Because it's enough for meaningfulness if we have it in our power to substitute things or ideas for the words when there is a call for it. It seems to follow also that words have a use additional to that of marking and suggesting distinct ideas, namely influencing our behavior. And there are two ways for them to do that: forming rules for us to act by, and arousing certain passions, dispositions, and emotions in our minds. So it seems that a discourse that tells us how to act or spurs the doing or not doing of an action can be useful and significant, even if the words making it up don't each bring a distinct idea into our minds.
It seems so.
Tell me, Alciphron, isn't an idea altogether inactive?
It is.
So an agent, something that does something, an active mind or spirit, can't be an idea and can't be like an idea. From which it would seem to follow that the words that stand for an active principle, soul, or spirit, don't stand for ideas in the strict and proper sense of ideas, but they aren't insignificant or meaningless, as I can show through one really striking example, namely the word I, or the word myself, as used by me. I understand what it signifies. I know what it means. But what it signifies isn't an idea and isn't like an idea. Rather, it is something that thinks and wills and grasps ideas and does things with them. It can't be denied that we know what is meant by the terms myself, will, memory, love, hate, and so forth. We have some notion that we understand relating to them, even though, strictly speaking, these words don't suggest distinct ideas to us.
What would you infer from this?
What I have inferred already, namely that words can be significant without standing for ideas. It's because people thought otherwise that the doctrine of abstract ideas has arisen.
Do you deny that the mind can abstract?
I don't deny that the mind can abstract in a certain sense of that word. We can think about one thing separately from another if, but only if, they could exist separately and could be perceived separately. So we can abstract by thinking about a man's head and not about his body, or think about color without thinking about motion, or think about shape without thinking about weight. But it doesn't follow from this that the mind can frame abstract general ideas. For example, thinking about color without thinking about any specific hue, which appears to be impossible.
Yet it is generally thought these days that every noun or substantive name marks out and exhibits to the mind one distinct idea separate from all others.
Tell me, Alciphron, isn't the word number a noun?
It is.
Well, now see if you can form an idea of number in abstract, not bringing in verbal signs or things that are numbered. Speaking for myself, I can't.
Can it be so difficult to form a simple idea of number, which is the subject matter of a most evident demonstrable science? Wait a bit. Let me see if I can abstract the idea of number from number words and numerals and from all particular countable things. To tell the truth, I don't find that I can.
Apparently, then, neither you nor I can form distinct, simple ideas of number. And yet we can make a very proper and significant use of number words and numerals. They direct us in the management of our affairs and do it in such an essential way that we would be lost without them. And yet, if other men's abilities are like mine, achieving a precise, simple, abstract idea of number is as difficult as is comprehending any mystery in religion. Welcome to the post dialogue reflection for George Berkeley's Alciphron. What we experience is very difficult to define as anything other than the effect produced in us. The famous "if a tree falls in the middle of the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound?" question encapsulates this dilemma. Sound is by definition the reception of the waves generated by their source's vibration. So how can that exist without a recipient? It's just the vibrational waves before it is actually sensed. Berkeley was apparently put this very question, and even though his theory of idealism begets it, his catch-all response to questions like this, and any question that might be raised concerning, say, the geologic record prior to conscious life, would be that God is always there to be the primary generative and percipient spirit, even when no one and nothing else is. Or there would be no forest impression in which anything tree-like could like fall in the first place. Thus, it would indeed make a sound to God's ears. But let's see if we can apply this query without the assumption of a God presence. Then nature must have some quality regardless of conscious perception of it, because as far as we're able to tell, the universe had billions of years in which to function without it, at least if our planet and the life it hosts are any indication. And yet, some things, like the concept of color, don't appear to have meaning except insofar as they are registered perceptibly. This is why it's very difficult to describe a sense to someone lacking it, as we just heard in our dialogue. And it is just as impossible to even imagine a sixth sense. Even if you can see dead people, well, you're seeing them. That's the sense in play there. Going back to color, we must hesitate to say that color, as we perceive it, inheres in an object, because color is a variety of perception, and yet we know that several factors like pigmentation, lighting, and our optical mechanics all contribute to a fairly predictable, measurable, observable outcome. There must be some correspondence of our sense to external reality. Evolution by natural selection does not select for senses that do not in some way conduce to our survival in our environments. But assuming we aren't perceiving every facet of our environments, we don't even have to assume it because we understand now the boundaries of our visible and audible spectra. What does it mean for something to have a natural quality that can't be compassed by a given sense? We aren't just talking about degree of instrumental precision here, but rather, in cases in which sight isn't applicable, what does anything look like? The question doesn't even make sense anymore. That is why Berkeley, for all his faulty assumptions, has stuck around at least as a quadlibetarian vestige. Let's go further with this question of sight, since that's Berkeley's main sensory hangup. If you are a microscopic organism living within the, to you, jumbo-sized fibers of a jacket, you might be surprised to learn that your narrow, minute view of the world is false. You are actually living in a sprawling, interconnected, T-shaped matrix of fuzzy insulation called a jacket. If you are a human wearing that jacket, you might be humbled to learn of what you're missing out on with your macro perspective. The jacket you think you're wearing is actually mostly empty atomic space. What this contrast in so-called actualities demonstrates is that while we should, of course, expand our perspective and question our senses, we frame that search for actual reality oddly when we axiomatically implicate vision, making a gratuitous problem for ourselves when we ask what a thing really looks like. Why should either perspective have primacy? Reality, it seems, accommodates both scales, and appearance isn't a feature of reality except insofar as it is seen. Sight is just a way to process whichever scale is most useful for a given organism. If we dispense with the wrong questions, we can get some amount of respite from these brain teasers. But, and here's that old rational empirical trade-off, in other cases, we can't think ourselves out of it with the information we have, and we need to expand the scientific investigation. Just because a problem is in a speculative stage, it doesn't mean all opinions of it are equally justified. Remember Galileo's warning to the theologians at the start of his dialogues? One day science may well rule on questions we thought we were entitled to have personal feelings about. Let's examine one such situation in which science has offered some clarity regarding our vision and its relationship to external reality. In our dialogue, we got a preview of what would become better known as the Molyneux problem, later taken up by Diderot. We'll see him in 2 units. The Molyneux problem questions whether a person with blindness who suddenly acquires sight later in life could identify a cube by sight alone. Berkeley used distance in his example. Berkeley, you remember, concluded that such an individual would need to experience distance as distance for it to make sense, and that neither the immediate perception of it on first seeing nor geometrical principles from prior to seeing would be sufficient to help them understand distance at the outset. Applications of the Molyneux problem in cataract removal trials have made this less speculative in recent decades, and it appears Berkeley is right in thinking that the sudden acquisition of sight does not automatically come with the facility of incorporating environmental stimuli or mapping them onto concepts previously only experienced in a tactile or auditory way. The brain needs time to adapt to new information stereooptically, photosensitively, and the time frame for doing so seems to be case dependent. The story of Cheryl Jennings, called Virgil in a 1993 New Yorker publication by the neurologist Oliver Sacks, offers a rare look into late life acquisition of vision and the subsequent adjustment process. But Berkeley's mostly lucky correctness on the necessary period of learning when gaining a new sense doesn't reflect in any way on the reliability of geometrical rule, only on our adeptness with it. And it also does Berkeley no favors towards proving that an object can have no existence beyond what is perceptible by some mind. And as we continue to learn more about mental visualization, including some limited potential for it even in those born with blindness, Berkeley's ideas, capital and lowercase I, remain at least interesting launchpads for ongoing discussion. Thomas Nagel's 1974 paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat, is a famous and accessible dive into the incommunicable nature of totally different perceptive experiences. John Locke, perhaps the most famous of this empirical set, one from whom Berkeley would selectively draw, had tried to separate out primary characteristics, mainly the extensibility of material bodies, we've heard that before and will again, from secondary characteristics, which were things like color and heat, things that required perception to be meaningful. Though heat, which we heard mentioned in Hylas and Philinus, is an interesting one because chemical material reactions to temperature fluctuations are very much wedded to the behavior of the objects to which they are applied or in which they take place, and yet the feeling of hotness or coldness is a different way to register those fluctuations than the molecular reactions they incite in an unfeeling object. So, if our senses do deliver useful accounts of our environment, but we know it is by definition impossible to experience a lack of consciousness or perception, on how much are we really missing out? Immanuel Kant, from whom we will hear again, would try to sort this out. We necessarily experience by experiencing. No argument there. And we do so in time and space. So whatever we experience must be communicable through those mediums. And therefore, the report of the senses must be somewhat mapped onto actual objects and reactions, but it is guaranteed to be filtered through our experience, if we experience it, and therefore necessarily changed by the mere fact of being perceived. But the question is how much of a gap this leaves us with, and if there are any means by which we might fill it in. We'll hear a bit more from Kant in the next unit. It's easy to tie our brains in knots over these questions, even if you reject Berkeley's theologically inclined conclusions. In our next unit, another empiricist, David Hume, will do something different with a similar acknowledgement of the limits of human perception. Thanks for staying for the post-dialogue. See you next time.